media companies.
It's amazing. You know, you feel all the energy all of a sudden. You know, you feel that, you know, there's nothing to stop you. And that's what John Cowperthwaite has given this praise. The aspiration, the hope, and the energy.
John Cowperthwaite is one of my favourite civil servants, probably, in fact, my favourite civil servant of all time.
Cowperthwaite went out there as a civil servant, and his job was to keep Hong Kong under control, but otherwise not to do anything. And he had the good sense not to do anything.
Once the government used to pressure that government should intervene in this and that and that and that and that, then you have a larger and larger public sector and a smaller and a dwindling private sector. And that's the end of the economy. And that's also the end of a civil society too. And I think that's very bad.
Britain was going down the road of a massive welfare state, very high levels of taxation, a very large interventionist government. But instead, Hong Kong chose a completely different path.
And as a result of Hong Kong flourished.
Growth exploded. The economy is growing by, you know, very large amounts every single year, year after year after year.
And it grew much faster than Britain did and became richer than Britain per capita in, I think, about 1999 or something. It was big, a big event.
Stars shining bright above.
John Cowperthwaite knew that lower tax meant higher profits, that higher profits meant more growth, and that more growth meant more jobs and higher wages. Before Cowperthwaite, Hong Kongers were about a third as rich as the British. Today, GDP per capita here is a third again higher.
The odd thing is, back in 1960, say, the average Hong Konger would have probably given their right arm for the chance to live in Sunderland. Nowadays, I suspect they'd regard it as a prison sentence.
Birds singing in the sycamore tree.
A small state and low taxes did for Hong Kong exactly what they had done for Britain in the 18th and 19th centuries, and news soon spread across the region. The Asian economic miracle had begun. In Hong Kong in 1961, the Scottish civil servant John Cowperthwaite decided to slash taxes, and the place took off like a rocket. Suddenly, in the 60s and 70s, everything seemed to be made in Hong Kong. And when the factories in Hong Kong could no longer cope, they outsourced work to other parts of Asia. News of Cowperthwaite's miraculous reforms also spread, and soon they were being copied throughout the region with breathtaking results, even in mainland communist China.
The main reason why they could see that this was the right thing to do was they could look at Hong Kong on their doorstep.
The Chinese finally realised that, wait a second, there's something going on in Hong Kong here that we need to imitate. You know, this is a Chinese city, yet it's booming.
If they can succeed so well in a little place like Hong Kong, if the whole of China moves from a socialist economy to a capitalist economy, what might be achieved? And the achievements have been very remarkable indeed.
Instead of busts of Marx and Lenin, the Chinese started producing hundreds of statues of John Cowperthwaite, who was hailed as Asia's man of the century. Cowperthwaite's low-tax revolution then spread to Eastern Europe, which in the 90s was emerging from the nightmare of socialism. A low-flat tax was introduced in countries like Russia and Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania, where growth rates suddenly shot up to as high as 8%, 11%, even 12% a year.
If you cut taxes, you make it easier to produce things, you make it easier to employ people, you encourage a dynamic economy, you sell more products, and you see your economy grow. It's as simple as that, really.
Given that only better-off Hong Kongers pay tax, given there's no VAT, no capital gains tax, no inheritance tax, you might expect there to be terrible services here. And yet, they have a transport system to die for. Platforms you could eat your dinner off. Giant gleaming snaking trains fitted with hundreds of TVs to entertain you. In the International Health and Education League tables, Hong Kong is always near the top, far ahead of the UK. How? Well, strange as it may seem, when tax rates were lowered here, tax revenues actually went up.
If you cut taxes, actually what you see is you've got a dynamic economy which as a percentage terms is taxing people less, but actually yields more in taxation revenue.
If you reduce taxes from very high levels, you can get more economic growth and more tax revenue.
Cutting tax rates actually stimulates economic growth, creates more profits, more jobs, and therefore the Treasury ends up with more tax.
What was once a shanty fishing port is now one of the world's most important commercial centres. This is where the Asian economic miracle began. It's also one of the most exhilarating places on the planet.
All these fast-growing emerging markets are very exciting places. If you just walk down the street in Hong Kong, you smell it in the air, you smell this optimism, this belief that people have that they can actually go out and achieve something, that they can build something.
People can help themselves. If you give them the chance, if you give them more freedom, if you give the market more freedom to create wealth and job and investment, people will have job and help themselves. The lesson for nowadays government to learn is to learn the humility in front of the people. To learn that it's the people who create wealth, given the freedom.
In communist China, the state controls around 28% of the economy. In Britain, the state controls 53% of the economy.
It is almost an iron law of economics, supported by 35 years of statistical research, that the bigger the state, the lower the level and the growth rate of national output.
The last government tested to destruction the idea that more spending was the answer.
The size of the state in Britain is now huge. I mean, more than half of all the wealth created in Britain is expropriated by the state.
The reason that the public sector has grown is because in the last couple of years, because of the recession, because of the financial crisis, it has affected the private sector. Now, I believe that any economy, in modern developed economy, will be mixed. You can argue exactly who ought to be doing what. I'm not doctrinaire about that.
The public sector spends more than the private sector in Britain, doesn't it?
Well, the public sector is an important part of our economy, of course, yes.
The public sector is bigger than the private sector now, isn't it?
Well, I mean, the two are mutually... The two parts of the economy depend on each other, don't they?
Well, I mean, the public sector certainly depends on the private sector. I mean, it's debatable how much the private sector depends on the public sector.
Well, government procures goods and services from the private sector.
But with the private sector's money, all the wealth comes from the private sector, doesn't it?
Well, the wealth comes from all of us. I mean, again, it depends quite what you define as wealth.
When are we actually going to realise that a growing state sector doesn't work? 55%? 60%? 65%? How much of the economy have our political classes got to control until we say enough?
Well, the era of big government is dead. The government can't expand any further, it can't tax any further, and it has a massive debt to repay.
People have to realise they're their own master. The state has to step aside and allow them to take responsibility for themselves, for their family, and for their children.
I've got £90,000 in my pyjamas.
For all George Osborne's so-called cuts, public spending in 2015 will actually be higher than it was in 2009, and our taxes will have gone up. Present government policy will not work. We must do in Britain what John Cowperthwaite did in Hong Kong. We must chop our bloated state in half. VAT, capital gains and other taxes should be scrapped. The less well-off should pay no tax. The better-off should pay no more than 20%. There is no big secret to economic prosperity. All we need is the wisdom and guts to do what's needed.
If material gain, if material solvency, if prosperity is your goal, we know how to get that. And the way to get that is you get as much government off your backs as you can, you get rid of debt as quickly as you can, you encourage savings, you encourage work. There's no mystery to that at all.
History is full of cases where governments have reversed policy and restored economic prosperity very, very rapidly.
I think you'd start to see the results almost immediately, within months, because I have great faith in the dynamism, the brilliance, the creativity of individual men and women in this country.
But it all depends on what is now a clinically obese state getting off the backs of the ordinary working people of this country.
If you want a glimpse of what Britain used to be like in its glory days, don't go to a museum. Take a trip to Hong Kong.
You learned the lessons, as it were, from the British of the 18th and 19th centuries. We can learn that lesson again, you think?
Obviously, because we learn it from the British people.
You have to go back to Adam Smith to start again. Start it all over again. Poor us.
I've got 90,000 pounds in my pyjamas. I've got 40,000 French francs in my fridge. I've got lots of lovely lira now. The Deutschmark's getting dearer, and my dollar bills would buy the Brooklyn Bridge. There is nothing quite as wonderful as money. Money, money, money. There is nothing like a newly minted pound. Money, money, money. Everyone must hanker for the butchness of a banker. It's accountancy that makes the world go round, round, round. You can keep your Marxist ways, but it's only just a phrase. For it's money, money, money makes the world go. Money.